Yep.
Cool.
Before we do dig in, can somebody who is in attendance just confirm that you can hear us, you can see the slide, audio, visual? If we could just get a confirm, since we're going up in numbers.
Looks like we're good.
Okay, perfect. Then we will jump in. Welcome everyone. Really excited to have you all here and to get started with this roundtable. Before we jump into the dialogue, a few quick updates. So participation, we are using Zoom webinar, as you know, as you're joining, and there will be some opportunities for participation. We definitely want to hear your thoughts and your questions. So you can use the chat. Just want to note that there's an option to toggle between the chat to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you want everyone to see, you'll want to be on that all panelists and attendees option. And then we will be having a live Q&A at the end. So you're welcome to put thoughts in the Q&A throughout our discussion, but especially when we have our Q&A at the end. Great, and a shout out to Mike from Upwork, who is supporting us technically. Really appreciate that. Okay, then want to cover a few agreements that we have today, some norms for this discussion. So we're dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone today. We sent out a code of conduct this week with the event registration information and reminders. So hopefully you've had a chance to review that. But at a high level, these are our agreements for our time together. So we're here to learn, dialogue, and create community. That's the goal of today. We want to avoid making assumptions, and no exclusionary or harassing speech or imagery is allowed. So if any of that comes up, you'll be removed immediately. We have a number of moderators. Big thanks to our volunteer moderators who are on the line helping. And if you do observe harmful behavior, what you should do is you should message Liz from Awaken directly. You'll see that you can search in the panelists for Liz. So send a message to her and Liz will remove any people as necessary. Anyone who violates the code of conduct will be removed. And do want to let everyone know that we are currently recording. So we are recording this event and we'll be distributing the recording afterward. There's also live transcription happening. So there's a link in the chat for the live transcription link. Please do utilize that. And if there are any issues technically with that, please let us know in the chat. All right. Let's hop in. I'm so excited to announce announce, that feels so formal, I love it. Introduce our panelists. We have an incredible group together today this group brings so much expertise, experience, and leadership. So I am your moderator. I'm Megan Kolar-Dwyer. I use she, her pronouns. And I work on global diversity, inclusion, and belonging at ServiceNow. And just so you know, ServiceNow is hiring. I just wanted to announce that since not all organizations are right now. So if you're looking for opportunities, feel free to reach out. On to our esteemed, incredible panel who it's been so wonderful collaborating on this event together these last few weeks. We have Dr. Erin Thomas with us, who uses she, her pronouns and is the head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging at Upwork. Hi, Erin, how are you doing today?
Hi, Megan. Thanks for asking. Like most folks, I'm processing a lot of conflicting and contrary emotions in the midst of this moment. So, you know, on the one hand, everything is obviously terrible and we're in the middle of a crisis. On the other hand, I am really excited to be here today, in particular to talk with folks who are in titular DEI, DIBS, IND diversity roles, because I actually think we have an interesting and timely opportunity to kind of ride this wave of COVID, if you will, and affect sustainable change in our companies and organizations. So dual-minded, but really excited for this hour and a half.
So glad to have you here, Erin, and excited for this discussion. We also have Helen Zia on the line, who is a long-standing activist and award-winning author. Helen has an incredible body of work. Just recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. Highly recommend you check that out. Helen uses she, her pronouns as well. How are you doing today, Helen?
Hi, Megan. I think I would just repeat what Erin said about kind of the mood. I think there's just so much uncertainty, and but within that, there's an opportunity to do things that are positive and to think for the future, the present, the future, and what's going to be beyond. And this webinar discussion today is just you know, such a highlight in that. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be joining all of you. And it's thrilling to know that so many people are joining in on this, because they also want to be thinking positive and what we can do in the midst of so much, you know, so much everything. So I just want to thank all of you for organizing this, and I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you, Helen. Really appreciate that you're here. I'm excited to hear your perspective. And yeah, I think we are over 350 folks on the line right now, which is incredible. We also have diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, Katrina Jones, on the line, who uses she, her pronouns. How are you today, Katrina?
I am doing okay. I've been saying my standard response now instead of fine or good is, you know, I'm okay. We take it day by day and hour by hour on some days, and, you know, create space and room for all of the feelings that we're having in this moment. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and to be in community with everybody. I just echo many of the sentiments that have already been shared. There are no words to articulate, you know, how hard, how difficult this moment is, and the chaos of it, all of it. And at the same time, there is, of course, tremendous opportunity if we can harness that wind to create systemic changes, to create a more equitable world and future.
Yeah.
My pronouns are also she, her, and hers.
Thank you, Katrina.
Yeah.
Really glad that you're here. And yeah, I think kind of living in this duality that Erin mentioned too, of not just knowing there's no real way to feel or to experience this, and there's a lot that's really inequitable, and we're seeing the resurfacing and the amplification of some of those things, but also, you know, folks, as they submitted questions in for our time today, saw kind of the balance of these things, of how do we acknowledge and process what's happening, and how do we also potentially try to create opportunity when and where possible. So glad that you're here. And then we also have Michelle Kim with us today, who is the CEO of Awaken, which is an incredible DEI organization. Michelle uses she, her pronouns. How are you today, Michelle?
I think +1ing on everyone's responses. You know, I think a lot of us have been reading articles and, you know, updates that say that the current situation is almost inducing people to be in stages of grief. And I feel like I'm going through that cycle of grief multiple times a day, just in terms of thinking through what I'm still holding on to as the state of being that was before and during this pandemic. So I think there's a lot of changes that we're all going through. And like Katrina said, I am also hopeful that so many folks today are excited to talk about how we center equity and inclusion in this conversation and during this time. And I've been seeing such an incredible rallying around different community organizing efforts. So really excited about what the current situation can bring. And I'm I spend a lot of time and a lot of my days just concerned about what is happening. So I'm hopeful and excited to bring some of those concerns to the forefront so we can actually have some, important conversations that are so needed to be had. And I'm so humbled to be here with everyone else. And thank you everyone for joining.
Absolutely. I think that element of change, feeling constant, and also, that's part of why we're here today, is to raise those concerns, to dialogue around them, to hear what other folks are thinking and doing. So really glad to have you, Michelle. So we will get started, but just
Megan, just a second. I know you're moderating, but it's important to see how you're doing today.
Oh, I appreciate that, Erin. Yeah, I mean, I echo what you all have said. I think I transitioned between like feeling horrified, feeling helpless, feeling confused, also then feeling cynical and unsurprised, and then sometimes feeling like I can center myself in where I think my locus of control is and how I can have impact. And all of those things are happening simultaneously, and that feels really jolting and uncomfortable. So I'm okay, but I've been looking forward to this conversation for weeks, quite honestly, but especially all week. So I'm glad to be here. I appreciate that, Erin. So one quick announcement before we dive in. Use the hashtag DEI Roundtable to share on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you can see these are our Twitter handles. We would love to connect with you, but I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of gems from this conversation, given the incredible folks we have around this figurative roundtable today. So please feel free to use that. All right. Okay, so we heard from the panelists how they're doing, how they're kind of showing up today. Want to hear from some of you. So use the Zoom chat. What brings you here today? What's top of mind? We know a lot of you submitted questions ahead of time, but how are you doing? Let's see.
So this is time for everyone on the call to type in how you're feeling. Make sure you've selected that you're submitting to all panelists and attendees. Seeing grateful, privileged, thankful.
Yeah, let's see. Mindful, wanting to learn, fatigued and exhausted.
Yeah. 3 kids off school, so chaos.
Defeated, grateful and sad and numb, united, community, anxious, smothered, hopeful, grateful and privileged but guilty, desire to do more, tired, disappointed, reflective, open to learn, lonely, grateful to be alive but very concerned, inspired, motivated, scared, always looking to learn. Yeah, appreciate you all sharing. A mix of emotions, it sounds like, which matches where we're at today too. And I think probably where most of us are at any given hour, any given day right now. Really appreciate you showing up and being here. Thank you for sharing. All right, so we're gonna dive into kind of some questions and getting really deep into this dialogue. Before we do though, I wanted to just show you a little bit of data around the questions that you all submitted. So we had over 175 questions submitted ahead of time through the event registration. I am astounded. And they are incredibly thoughtful, relevant, tactical, strategic. They were really great questions. So what we did is I analyzed the 175 plus questions and grouped them into some categories because some themes really emerged. So these are the themes we're going to kind of center our conversation around today, but wanted to just show you this data data. So a lot of your questions came in around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, really what should we be doing in this space, how to get leaders either committed or staying committed. What tips do you have? What are other people doing? Lots of questions around that. There were a number of questions specifically centered on the racism, anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, wanting to dig into that, to acknowledge and to really talk about those concerns, as well as recent data that has been coming out, continues to be coming out, that shows the really horrific health disparities, particularly for Black and African Americans. So questions specifically around that, as well as some questions around how do we address this? What about allyship here? How do we come together in solidarity to really stop this and change these systems and these inequities that we actually know have been in place, but are really being amplified and coming to the surface. And then a lot of questions around how to center marginalized communities. Incredible amount of questions around how do we continue to center equity? How do we prioritize the most marginalized during this time? Who should we be considering that we might not be thinking about? And then finally, there were a number of questions around kind of this new experience that many of us are in, remote work, those that aren't able to work remotely, that are deemed essential workers, these new considerations. So those are the themes that we're going to touch on. But then we're also going to go to some specific questions from you all and live Q&A. So wanted to just give you a snapshot. And I am going to stop sharing so that we can go back to our face view. And we'll get started. So the first question that we have here is really, how have employees been responding to this situation, and how have organizations been responding? And we'll start with Erin, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I'd love to start with 2 quick data points. It's timely, I guess, that our Q1 engagement survey just closed. We use Glint and had the wherewithal to ask a COVID-specific question, just in terms of how did people feel about our company's responsiveness to what we're all experiencing. One thing that was really heartening to see was that folks were really satisfied with that response, and I'll detail in a bit what it was. And importantly, that satisfaction, if you can call it that, with our response was equitable across lines of demographic lines. So that was important for us to dig into, to make sure that we're keeping folks as whole as they can be. Another really compelling data point for us is that purpose is as high as ever within our organization. So we're a mission-driven company. We are entirely founded and operate around providing economic opportunities so people have better lives. So we're a freelancing platform and couldn't be more relevant right now, which is really nice to see. So our folks are obviously going through those personal emotions and roller coasters and grieving, just as each and every one of you expressed. And at the same time, we as a company, we as an organization have really come together, which is exciting and I think helps us with our resilience. The response has been from the top down. I'm in a very fortunate position with such a strong and empathetic and human leadership team and organization. So it took no prodding from me for our CEO, our leadership team to double up on the comms twice weekly. Now we've moved to once weekly, now that we've kind of settled into this new normal. We restructured company time. So we're focused on freelancing, connecting people to jobs. And so Customer Wednesdays is a thing now. So just marking that, owning that, so we can focus on what we're here to do in a way that serves us and serves the broader community. And we had a recharge day, which was such a gift. We have unlimited PTO anyway. So in a sense, you could say, well, why mark a day? But it was exactly because anyone could have taken it, but no one probably was going to, that our CEO said, listen, March 27th, recharge, restore, we all need it. And it was such a blessing. I hope my husband's not watching because I didn't tell him I had the day off. Took a really long bath and it was blissful. Our leaders have really over-indexed on empathy, emotional check-ins, balancing that with expectations around performance, and obviously easing up and being people about what they're expecting of folks. And then from a strictly DEI perspective, we've built lots of candid conversations around everything that you all surfaced in the chat. And so we're just hitting this on all notes and also finding moments to not talk about COVID, because some folks need to distance themselves. And I'm sure many of us go through that cycle as well. So, you know, expressing gratitude. We have an uplift series where it's just like silly pictures and freelancer gratitude. So on-demand touch points that will hit everyone exactly when they need it. And it's been really, really helpful for me.
Thank you for sharing so many like valuable specific examples there of Upwork showing up. Other folks on the panel want to add on or a new perspective? Looks like Katrina, you unmuted.
Yeah, I'd love to share kind of what I'm seeing broadly across the business landscape and tech in the industry that I'm part of. And it really has been a complete, I think, mix of responses in terms of businesses trying to pivot quickly to meet needs of employees and needs of the communities that they are in and communities that they serve. And we're seeing a range of what that looks like, right? So everything from reducing pay, right, so that you can keep people on staff, ensuring that hourly workers are still paid, that they still are maintaining their benefits, even if they are not working on site within the organizations. Employees mobilizing, what I've seen a ton of, and what is really inspiring is seeing people mobilize to serve their communities. So recognizing that they may be well situated to, for example, be able to take time to volunteer or to create masks for those who need them, be it healthcare workers or other people. I want to share one example that I recently heard about from a family member of mine who works for a media company, and the employees are, and they're based in New York City. The employees are making masks, and specifically they're making masks for Black and brown people in New York, knowing that the pandemic has disparately impacted those communities in terms of who's getting sick and who's dying. And that, when you talk about, you know, serving your community, that is such a great example of what that looks like. There's tons of fundraising happening. I think on a more personal level, it's also that day-to-day, right, of checking in with people and being intentional about checking in and asking people how they're doing, creating that space for people to share all of their feelings. I think there is a tendency to say, let's keep it, we want to be positive or share some positive things that take our mind off of it. And that may be helpful for some people. And at the same time, we need to ensure that people have space to talk about their anxieties, to talk about their fears, to talk about their hardships, and to talk about the things that they're worried about for themselves and working, and for their families, for their communities. These are the times that call for us to move differently, to do differently. And so seeing a lot of that, seeing, you know, lots of pivoting, and that takes hard work. It requires a different kind of energy to think more creatively and differently about how do you run your business, how do you keep people employed, how do you make sure that you're caring for all employees, and how do you support the community, and especially the most vulnerable in your communities.
Yeah, I love those examples too, Katrina, especially bringing in the kind of community and external partners piece. There was a specific question on the chat before you started talking, so you answered it beautifully. I appreciate too the specificity and the wider range of approaches. That made me think about the fact that, you know, flexibility, like part of what you're describing too is like staying flexible, staying agile. in this time and thinking about different groups, different communities, and the unique needs that those different groups may have. So really thinking about all your employees and thinking, what do specific groups of people need? Masks for Black and Brown folks, and maybe specific masks, right? I saw something yesterday that somebody shared, you know, it was a Black man who shared, I don't feel comfortable wearing a mask as a Black man in New York. So it's a specific type of mask.
Yes, so that we're talking about it literally this morning, of creating pastel colored masks, right? Like we're not creating masks from bandanas because we already know that there are stereotypes and negative associations, and we have to recognize that we need to keep people safe, right? Like safe, yes, from COVID-19, and also safe from physical violence and being perceived as a threat. So that's baked into the solution of we're creating these pastel masks, like, you know, make it look soft so that people are less likely to call the police on somebody wearing a mask.
Yeah. I appreciate that level of consideration, and also wish that weren't the level of intention that is required, because of the realities and the inequities and the bias and the racism and the discrimination that currently exists and many people are moving through on a daily basis. Michelle, I noticed that you unmuted at one point. Is there anything else you want to add here?
I just really wanted to amplify and lift up the importance of asking people what their needs are. I think, you know, in our work with a lot of different organizations, a lot of people are overwhelmed, right? People are stretched. People are not just working from home, right? We're in a global pandemic, and I think it's really easy for people to forget that they are dealing with a lot of different types of burden and additional emotional labor that is being put on them, whether that is, you know, parenting, caregiving, or concerns for their loved ones, or themselves being immunocompromised or dealing with mental health. Like, you just never know all the different dimensions of identities that are impacting people's experiences right now. And I think more than ever, we really need to lift up those conversations around equity and inclusion, and what does that really mean, right? It has to do with all of our social identities impacting us in different ways that provide us with different access, different resources, different considerations. So I just wanted to, you know, appreciate what was shared by all the panelists so far, and really driving home the point that this is not impacting everybody the same way, and we need to really understand how we can show up for different marginalized people.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Thank you for making that, Michelle. I see somebody asked a question in the chat that feels connected to this, of like, love to hear panelists' thoughts on the etiquette of using cameras. And that reminded me of some of these approaches that I think organizations are taking, where they're saying everyone must use cameras, or we're going to do this widespread universal, we're going to implement this thing. Chances are, if that's the way that you're thinking, you may not be asking that question of what do different communities need? Have we asked what people need? Have we considered all the social identities and factors by thinking about this as a good idea, something that may seem like a good idea, but who is it really working for, and who might it not be working for? So really kind of using those considerations in this time more than ever. That sort of always should be an inequity approach, but I think especially right now, that feels particularly important. Before I jump to the next question, is there anything you want to add here, Helen?
Well, I'm just reminded as I listen to everybody that being socially distant and, you know, having to work from home and shelter in place does not mean that we have to be isolated from each other. And I think you've all given such great examples about that. And Megan, what you just said about asking, to me, this is really a time where we are also kind of stripped down to examining what is important to us in our lives and what we can do to make a difference. And, you know, a lot of people that I talk to think, well, that means I have to change the world and come up with a solution for climate change or racism and inequities. And actually it's about what can I do as an individual? What are my strengths and what can I bring to that? And what don't I know? And how can I reach out to somebody that, you know, maybe worked in the cubicle next to me and I never really had a conversation with them about their communities and what they're going through. And so I guess I'm just, you know, adding to what you all have said. But I think this is a time where we really can sort of think about what's important to the, you know, that I can add and make a difference in this world so that when we come out of this, I can actually do something that has moved us forward. And so anyway, that's what I was thinking as I was listening to all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Helen.
I just wanted to respond to that because I think some of the questions that we've been getting is that, you know, right now people are not able to prioritize DEI. And our leaders are not paying attention to this. How do we make sure that this doesn't get lost? Because we are dealing with layoffs and chaos and, you know, all kinds of different business decisions that are impacting people's livelihoods. So I think DEI as a, you know, discipline is being seen as yet again an extracurricular topic, right? That can only be prioritized when there is time and there's money and there's space and bandwidth for people to be able to think about it. So I just really appreciate your question there, Helen, around what is important to us right now, and also imploring people to think about DEI as not an extracurricular topic, right? This is something that is an approach that we have to take to every decision we make when it comes to layoffs, when it comes to cutting costs, when it comes to how we are showing up for our community today. So I'd love to see us, you know, leaving this conversation, showing up in a way that prioritizes DEI not as a separate subject that can only be prioritized when it's convenient, but it's actually the way that we approach everything that we do, especially in a moment like this.
Can I
say yes to
yes.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the moment, hell yes, the moment lays bare that it is actually more important. This is a moment to double down on it, right? When we're seeing the disparate health outcomes and impacts in our communities, it is because we have not done enough within DEI work, within companies, within our society, right, to build a more equitable society, to make sure people have access to health care, right, that they have access to adequate food, that they have accesses to the resources they need to, you know, for education and so many other things, housing, right? If we do that work during times where we don't have a pandemic, it means that when we are in the middle of a crisis, whatever that crisis is, that we will be better for it, that we will not have the most vulnerable to be the most impacted. And so if anything, this moment actually says, no, we should double down on this. I think about the impact for Black and Brown communities, for Asians within America, in this moment, for Native American communities, disabled communities. And again, this is exacerbated because in large part, we have not given our full effort, full force to this work.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
Helen. Yeah, Helen.
And just one other note to that too, in seeing the impact of this virus, we are also seeing who is most essential in our society. And the irony is that many of the most vulnerable communities, you know, who don't have full-time jobs or don't have stable places to live or food security, they're the essential workers. They're the ones that we depend on, and they are the ones who are most exposed to you know, the harm of this virus. And so when we talk about DEI, you know, especially the, you know, the decision makers at the top, they also need to examine who is most essential as well. And the attention that, you know, why we need to have this discussion and attention being given to these vulnerable communities.
Yes.
Can I jump in there and extend on that, Megan?
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna do it anyway, so I shouldn't have asked, but I'm just so like into this thread because, like I completely agree, Helen, and I actually want to share a kind of inversion of what Katrina said around, DEI is more important than ever. I think it's always been as important as it's ever been. It's more urgent now than ever, right? If you think about just like an important, urgent matrix, which a lot of business leaders love to talk about. So it's shifted in terms of its urgency, but at its root, people need what they've always needed. Foundationally, they need a living wage, they need job security, they need benefits that serve them. And on top of that, in terms of the work that maybe some of you might be contributors toward, folks need candid communications, they need clear performance expectations, they need people first leadership, they need flexibility, and a lot of these things are related. And so what's happening sort of outside can actually be brought in because a lot of orgs are reckoning, to your point, with what is important to us. And so as we're kind of stripping things back to the bare essentials, it's an opportunity, that window I talked about earlier, to rebuild with equity as a footbed for how it is we think about how work happens, what's needed, and who's needed, as opposed to this add-on or this extracurricular like Michelle mentioned. So I actually just think as folks are vulnerable and exposed, and that's true of leaders as well, and Michelle wrote an article about this, we could actually, in a strange way that is opportunistic, leverage that emotionality, leverage this moment to compel and motivate folks to really, again, reckon with our humanity. So I just think a lot of the things we're talking about on the outside can kind of ripple into how we focus on our workforces and workplaces.
Yeah, wow. I just want to plus 1,000 to everything each of you has shared and built off one another. I think hearing you all share this too, as a DEI practitioner within an organization, I think a helpful argument or sort of point here as well is, if we design, like I'm thinking about inclusive design principles. So if we design for maybe who has been the traditionally underserved user or who is the most marginalized, that's actually going to benefit everyone. Like there's loads and loads of data and research in that. And so as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking not only is it the right thing to do, not only is it helping us answer the question of what's important to us and do we really care about each other and humanity, but also like if we care about ourselves, which I know a lot of leaders do, and sometimes it can be hard to have the conversation or to feel like, how do I approach this in a convincing way? If it feels like you're in that situation and you feel like you have to convince people, there's a strong case right now, to your point, Erin, the urgency around shifting our approach to this inclusive design, right? Really centering equity, designing for the most marginalized in order to impact and uplift everyone. So
yeah, I think that is a point really to underscore that inclusive. What does inclusive mean when we talk about inclusive? Because when we say the majority, we end up saying the majority, like abled, cisgender, predominantly white, middle class, and so this is about whom are we centering in this moment? Who are we focusing on and how that benefits the majority? And we have to first focus on the most marginalized, the most vulnerable.
Yes, agreed. Gonna switch to our next question. It's related, it's all connected in this conversation, but want to really create space for this question specifically, which is, can you talk about the anti-Asian discrimination and marginalization that's been resurfacing during COVID-19? We'll start there, and then I have a follow-up question too. But Helen, do you want to start on this one?
Sure. It's been in the news, I think there have been a lot of questions already from people, who are on this webinar. But the attacks, the assaults, the harassment, the bullying, the frankly, racism and anti-Asian violence that's been happening has been in the news a bit. But you know, there are things that I'm just astounded by that have not been even made it to the national news, where a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old in a Sam's Club in Texas got stabbed, and, you know, by somebody who intended to kill them, and would have succeeded had some, you know, other people in the store not intervened. And there have, I'm checking on a report that I've heard that there's actually been a murder in Alabama that might be hate related. It's not confirmed. The FBI even has issued some alerts saying that there's a rise in sort of hate chat going on by extremist groups identifying Asians and Jews to prey upon. And as a former journalist, I did track neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, and they feed off of chaos. They feed off of division. And so there's something important to know, that we didn't just suddenly have these incidents happening, hate crimes and so forth, because of COVID. As you know, the previous discussion we've had, you know, these things have been accentuated now. And what happens with these hate groups is that they feed off of chaos. They feed off of division. And we've been in a period of time, certainly, I'm not going to go political here, but we do have a lot of leaders and top leaders who really have fed hatred and actually gave praise to neo-Nazi groups and don't speak up about hate crimes. And so that's all kind of created a situation today now where so many, you know, the whole country and really the world is in crisis, and people are losing loved ones. And so even before the lockdown happened, these attacks were accelerating, and some of it was appearing in the news. But with the lockdown and with the hate speech that came out of, I'm sorry, the white supremacy house, a number of groups set up hotline reporting systems, so that there are 3 around the country. And one of them has been most active. And immediately, the first week they put that up in mid-March, they had more than 600 reports of hate incidents that covered the spectrum of things. And the following week, more than 1,000. And really what they're reporting is that more than 100 incidents a day have been happening that are reported. So we don't even know or have any idea how many are not being reported. And so I have to say, what I have found disturbing, but also coming from, you know, accentuating what was already there, is the invisibility and marginalization of these things, because the narrative thread in hearing about these reports is the comments are coming out like, oh, now Asian Americans are discovering racism. Welcome to the club. Now you know what it is. Or, so what? Look at all of, you know, that's been going on. And so here's the thing, you know, racism and hate, violence, and so forth toward Asian Americans is nothing new. That's something that's been happening ever since day one, that people of Asian descent have been on this continent. And there are records of it, there's history. If anybody wants to know more about it, there's plenty of resources about that. But even in, and you know, looking at this conference and many people being in the Bay Area, I would think, I mean, the Bay Area was ground zero for an ethnic cleansing policy that the United States had starting in the 1800s. And you had states like, say, Idaho, that now is one of the whitest states in the country. However, in the 1800s had more Chinese Americans and Asian Americans there than any other people. But because of ethnic cleansing, because of massacres, because of lynchings that happened toward Asian people, they disappeared. And so, you know, in the course of how America came to be the way it is, part of it is, you know, all rooted in the systemic racism that's happened not just to Asian Americans, but also African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and, you know, we can go into that. But in today's violence, what we're finding is You know, I mentioned the 2-year-old and the 6-year-old that got stabbed. You can actually find pictures of them. The 2-year-old has a gash from his eye all the way to his ears, all stitched up. And, you know, how do we not know about that and recognize that this is going on? In my history, I've been an activist, and I lived in Detroit, Michigan. I was a factory worker there before I became a journalist, and worked in the auto industry when the collapse of the auto industry, and for those of you who are interested in economics, it was the collapse of the manufacturing sector of America. And that's when our economy turned into a service economy, which many of you are part of. And in that time, millions of people became unemployed. You know, the current unemployment record, you know, numbers are more than 16 million Americans unemployed. Well, in that time, through the Midwest and then the rest of the country, people stood in lines that we see on the news, in unemployment lines, snaking around city blocks, and the pain and misery that people were experiencing over a period of years was so deep that, of course, people were frustrated and outraged to have no future at all. And what happened is looking for people to blame and to point the finger at, you know, and so we see that going on every night if we want to watch the press briefings every day. But it's all about blaming and who to blame. And in the 1980s and 1990s, that blame was to Japan and anybody who looked Japanese. And yes, there were hate crimes that came out of that. There was a very landmark hate killing that took place. A Chinese American man named Vincent Chin was killed because he looked Japanese. But what people don't realize is there were many other things that happened too. There was a mass killing that took place in Stockton, California. You know, a guy suited up in his camouflage outfit and his AK-47 and went to an elementary school that was predominantly Southeast Asian immigrants. And he killed 5 8-year-olds, a couple of teachers. And here's the thing, where a lot of discounting and marginalization of like, oh, so you Asian Americans, so what? Somebody spit on you, that's nothing. Well, the spitting or the name calling leads to, you know, it's just a window on other violence. And in that case in Stockton, California, the very first thing that the police chief of Stockton said was, oh, well, this is not a hate crime. We're not even considering that. And so all too often what we see is people just discounting that. And I would just say that, you know, we're talking about workplaces and so forth. And the thing is, how do we reach out to people and make them feel that they are safe? You know, that maybe, you know, before they showed up for work, whether it was remotely or not, they had an incident happen to them that day and they're totally discombobulated by it. But I know many Asian Americans at this point who are terrified, actually, afraid to go out and go for a walk, afraid to take their kids out, afraid to go shopping. And so many of these incidents that are being reported are just in the course of doing those things. So, you know, in this conversation, I would like us to get into what we can do about it, but that is kind of where we are today. And in the tech world, there's a report out this morning that some of the groups that monitor chat rooms and monitor the kind of things that are appearing worldwide, there is just a level of violence that's going on about how people should take out their assault weapons and go to, you know, a place where there are a lot of Asians. And that might be a workplace. And that's something that everybody should be thinking about too on this call. And so that has spiked and is continuing to spike. So these are things that we should all know about. And then there are things we can do about them too.
I really appreciate that, Helen. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, really important history, your experiences, your perspective. Some things were coming up from the audience during your when you were sharing, Helen, and there were some points that came up that resonated with me too, around kind of this intentional division between different racial and ethnic groups, right? That it's actually, you know, often there by design, and an intentional strategy to continue to center whiteness and to maintain the status quo that, you know, those comments around, oh, that's not a hate crime, or we could never consider, you know, an experience like being spit on or yelled at as you're walking in your neighborhood to the same degree. And as we start to get into comparing different levels of discrimination or different experiences between, you know, ethnic and racial groups, that starts to create the divisions, right? It reinforces a lot of this really horrible, insidious, intentional, systematic racism and discrimination that has been upheld in this country and in many places around the world for centuries. So just kind of acknowledging that, commenting on that, calling that out because folks called it out as well. I want to transition though to what you suggested, Helen, is does anyone on the panel have ideas for how to acknowledge this, how to create space for folks, specifically Asian and Asian Americans right now, to process what might be happening to them, you know, in sort of thinking that they're showing up at work, or other ideas around this?
Yeah, so I think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's important here to acknowledge one and recognize, like, this is happening, even if it's not, we don't have reports from our employees or, you know, internally of them being personally impacted. I don't think that has to be a prerequisite for holding space for the conversation, for making sure that they have resources. I think that often we, you know, businesses and leaders will say, well, we haven't heard of anything, right? Like, we surveyed and that's not an issue. One, people aren't always forthcoming. They don't necessarily feel comfortable being forthcoming. And two, think about the, you know, folks' extended families and communities that they're connected to. Even if it doesn't happen to you directly, you're a part of this identity group and you are impacted. I'm seeing people talk about how their partners or they themselves are afraid to wear you know, when engaging in public, and to wear a mask or to not wear a mask because they're Asian. And you don't have to have something to happen directly to you, right? Like, you know that this is happening in the sphere. So it's important for, even without specific examples from employees, to create that space and make sure that people have resources when it comes to, like, counseling, mental health, and actually just talking about this. And I'm just going to throw this out there really quickly. Also talking about solidarity between and amongst our groups. I think that's what makes, Helen, what you were saying and what we're talking about in part so difficult, is that nuance of, you know, the model minority myth, the proximity to whiteness, and how that's been weaponized against other racial ethnic groups, and the perception that Asians have sat outside of some of the fights for civil rights. It's a false perception, but it exists. But if anything, it is I think, a clarion call to solidarity and how do we come together for all folks.
If I could just make a comment about that, about the solidarity piece. When I say that we're in a period of the context of where we're in today, about the divisions and the separations and the divisiveness that exists, I'm talking about at least 2 decades of that. So I think for many of the, especially millennials, you know, Gen XYZ, you know, have only experienced a world, a country where groups are pitted against each other, where it's like, your group didn't do this or your group doesn't do that, and you do this to us and you do that to us, and you take any combination of groups, that is the what we've been experiencing. for the last couple of decades. And I just want to say, because I'm old enough to remember a time when actually people were in solidarity. You know, this experience in Detroit. I was an Asian American in Detroit. Detroit then and now is a majority African American city. And, you know, it was a partnership between Asian Americans and African Americans and Latinos and Jews and every religion you can imagine. And, you know, it was a multi-class, multicultural coalition of people standing together for justice. That happened in the civil rights movement. It happened in so many of really the history of America. And what we have been denied today is a vision of that. And so I think we have to remember the recriminations that go back and forth and accusations about each community, that we all have been poisoned. And we have to remember that ignorance allows that poison to set in. And so, you know, people on this call have access to the internet. There's information, real information that can be found to see times that people actually stood together. And just one other thing about the reports, people going to people in authority, say in your companies or police departments, when these nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups were collecting 600 reports a week, the chief of police in San Francisco said, we haven't had a single report. I mean, you know, within the Asian American community, like a lot of communities, there's either a distrust or a disbelief that the authorities will do anything. So that may not be where they go first to make a report. So just because we hear that, well, you know, such and such police department hasn't received any reports, that doesn't mean it's not happening. Or such and such manager says that, well, I've never heard anything. It doesn't mean it's not there. So,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Helen, you know, can I jump in here? I mean, everyone in the chat is asking for like more tangibles, more specifics. How can this be done? And Michelle has done this, and she's done this at Upwork like a week ago. It feels like forever ago. So can you share more about what this looks like? And Michelle, it's making me think we should write this up and make it actionable, because a lot of the questions too are about like, how can we do this for free? Talking, naming, recognizing what's going on is free, you know, minus time. So Michelle, can you just share how we structure that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for everybody's contributions to the conversation. I think, you know, there's so many different things that we need to address when it comes to what's happening right now, but particularly when it comes to Asian Americans or Asian people in the US, our history and our stories. By design, the kind of racism that Asian people face in this country is erasure. And I think that flavor of racism, we need to be very cognizant about how that is being portrayed in the media, in our conversations, and even sort of the dismissal of the pain and the trauma that we are experiencing. That's very specifically designed to be that kind of flavor of racism that we experience. So for people to be able to actually understand the history that Helen is bringing up, I think is so critical, because, you know, then and now, I actually have seen, as a millennial, the racial solidarity across different coalitions, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of healing on both sides for us to be able to actually show up for each other and to be able to hold space in the complexity that we're holding right now, right? As Asians, I think there's the conversations around the model minority, right? That we are doing better than other immigrants, so we should be grateful, or that there isn't deserving of attention or money. So, you know, Asian nonprofits are actually very under-resourced. And there are undocumented Asian Americans here, or Asian folks here. There are people who are in poverty who are not getting the needs met. So there's sort of this erasure that we're constantly having to fight, whether that's historical erasure, where our, you know, ancestors who have been part of these movements are completely wiped out of the history, right? Then, you know, that helps us pit us against each other. So I think it's really important, if there's one thing that you can do as non-Asians, learning about the history, learning about who is actually doing this work today, because there are very progressive radical Asians out there doing the activism work right alongside Black and Latinx people who are, again, getting erased over and over, right? I think that is such an important call out that I need to make. And hold the complexity that there is work to be done within our Asian American communities too, right? There's anti-Blackness that we have to address. And something that has been coming up is this very sort of volatile relationship that we have with other people of color communities, right? Where we need to also acknowledge that and hold those complexities and be able to have these conversations so we can heal together. And one thing that has come up during our conversation at Upwork, and I really appreciate companies actually creating space for this conversation, especially during this time. People want to know how they can respond, and one of the suggestions was to call the police. And I think that's where things get really tricky, right? When you see Asian Americans being attacked in the streets, do you call the police and potentially threaten people who are witnessing, who may be Black, undocumented, Latinx, whomever is much more of a threat when the police gets involved? So we need to actually talk about these nuances when it comes to building solidarity across different POC groups, because without these nuanced conversations, everything will fall apart. So I think it's so important for us to, when we're doing allyship work, being able to hold that nuance, because we're not one-dimensional beings, right? We need to be able to acknowledge our historical complexities, to the flavors of racism that we all each experience differently, and also to be able to dispel some of the myths and the designs of racism that were created by white supremacy to pit us against each other. But we can't do that unless we acknowledge and hold these complexities. And that is so hard. And I get it, because I'm doing this work every day with teams. And I believe, and I hope that we are complex enough human beings who can be in the nuance and the messiness of it, so that we can come out of this with more solidarity, more coalitions, and more strength in being able to hold each other's trauma with more gentleness and care.
Yeah, and I mean,
so much. Oh, I just want to pop in real quick, Erin, to just one extension of that, to that point that we are not singularly dimensional or multidimensional, this intersectional piece. There's a number of comments and questions bringing in the LGBTQ community, which we haven't touched on, but I think as we really think about working across these intersections and across in effort to build coalitions, as well as what you were saying, Michelle and Helen and Erin, kind of learning from history, specifically someone brought up, are there learnings we can take from the LGBT community in terms of how they were treated in the early days of HIV? Understanding that folks who are trans or non-binary have really limited access to healthcare, and that there's an intersection that a lot of folks who are in these groups are also Asian and Asian American, are Black and brown individuals, some of whom are immigrants. So I just want to call that out and acknowledge the complexity element. And then Erin.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I know we're going to open up to Q&A in a minute, but I wanted to just extend on this conversation around tactics, because two things are popping up to me that are probably relevant to a lot of folks who are in organizations right now. One is the fact that, as you know, especially in tech, but across the board for companies I've worked in and companies I've worked, and consulted for, there's this sort of netherworld of, do Pan-Asian employees count? Do they not count? Is that part of diversity? Is it not? And so when we talk about this erasure and this minimizing and numbers versus experiences, that is one actionable conversation, one actionable decision that you all can hopefully affect in terms of, really turning over your employee data and carving out that tailored understanding of where are we in terms of representation? What does that look like across levels of our organization? And as we're measuring experiences, really not clumping Asian employees together with white employees, or taking them out and really not talking about them. It's this very bizarre phenomenon that I've seen again and again. So it manifests in the workplace as well. One other thing, just going back to tactics, but also extending from what Michelle said around this complexity. Here's the thing, business leaders work with the most complex problems and innovative problems that the world has ever faced. And so, to your point, we can do it, and now's the time. And one way to kind of ground that, something that I've been working on and really excited about, that's beyond just talking, but it's really about processes, right? Redesigning our orgs is, most companies, again, are at this place where they're continuity planning, right? They're figuring out how do we recover from this? They're figuring out how do we build the true mechanics of our organization to, you know, respond and recover from this downturn and to be able to withstand any sort of surprises like this in the future. For us, what that's opened up is a conversation that's grim but necessary around, you know, during this time of panic and uncertainty, we need to have some talent continuity conversations and plans. If somebody has to go out in a pinch, who is ready to take their spot, at least in the short term? Well, that's opening up a longer term conversation around succession planning. And obviously DEI comes in at the back end and the front end in terms of, we heard it before, what are the critical skills that we need? And also, what does the diversity of this bench of future potential leaders look like? And is it what we want it to be and expect it to be? And if not, cool, we've got some wiggle room to start to plant the seeds to diversify that pipeline. Okay, well, in that process, we're having these skills and sort of expertise conversations. That's a natural segue into refining or rebuilding performance management systems. And so all of this can connect, again, from this place of upheaval that we're all in. And I would encourage you all, if you're in that type of role, to start to think about those connection points, because I actually see it as very linear. And we can approach this at the conversation level, the awareness level. You can reach in, obviously, one-to-one to groups or to individuals from these marginalized backgrounds. And also, if you're in the right position or have the right ear, you can be approaching this from the process standpoint as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point, Erin. And thank you for those specific kind of tactical recommendations. It sounds to me like, which is often true in this work, that there's kind of things we can do as individuals, and harking back to the conversation just a few moments ago, like we probably all have a lot to learn. So thinking about where might my gaps be, where might my sort of ignorance or the poison. I really liked that analogy, Helen. That sounds intense, but that's what it is. Like, what version of history have I learned, by whom, for whom? How can I start to combat that as an individual? Whether I'm in this D&I space, or I'm a business leader, or I'm a nonprofit organizer, or I'm an artist. I know we have a few wide variety of folks that's registered. So thinking about what I can do as an individual, but then also, to your point, Erin, what can we do structurally, especially if we are DEI leaders or leaders within an organization? We actually have a lot of control, a lot of decision-making power generally, particularly if we come together. Right? If we not just the chief diversity officer, perhaps, or the head of DIBS, diversity, inclusion, belonging, whatever it might be, but business leaders at every part of the enterprise or every part of the organization coming together and asking these questions. What processes should we audit? You know, you can start there. What's working well, what isn't? Who have we heard from? Who have we not heard from? What do we need to start redesigning? And who are we centering, right? I think this big question around, okay, we have some of these processes in place. Who did we build them for? Right? Asking that and saying, did we center folks with disabilities? Did we center a wide variety of racial ethnic groups when we think about how different groups, different types of people might be moving through our workplace and trying to thrive? Are we setting up everyone, but specifically right now, the most marginalized or the people who might be facing barriers?
I just want to say this really quickly, because I think for most corporate America or global corporations, we should assume that we are built on a foundation that is steeped in white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity, that is the foundation, and that is how our organizations were built. Our processes are steeped in and built from. And so, again, with whom are we centering and approaching with an equitable design lens and thinking about what does that look like? And I myself, when you talk about, Megan, checking yourself and raising that self-awareness, have to continually do that internally, because I've got that mindset as well, right? Like, I'm American, born and raised in Texas, and And it is really hard to break from that. But I often think about, you know, that exercise of if you could wave a magic wand, right? Like imagine you have all you have the power and the control within a specific group of people. How would you design? What would that look like? What outcomes are you trying to get to?
Yeah.
I think something that like really specifically talking in terms of process change and systems change, there's many decisions that are being made today when it comes to hiring. A lot of folks are right now unemployed and being laid off. Really re-examine how you're making those criteria, developing that criteria to hire people, right? People have been complaining about not having diverse enough pipeline. Well, now's your chance to build that pipeline up right now, because we know the layoffs are disproportionately impacting women and people of color because the positions that they've held are more considered disposable than other roles. Catalyst just put out a report saying women are impacted more so by the layoffs that are happening. So, well, now's your chance to go hire women, go hire people of color, but make sure that that systems that you're using are equitably designed. Right. And when companies are making layoff decisions, then that's also a point where you can start to really examine, are there particular demographics of people that are being more impacted than others by the layoffs? And I think this is when the equity mindset becomes so critical in designing your processes and validating your decisions. So for me, it's always been, you know, if you're going to tout your company as a company that cares about DEI, that's not enough. And it's not enough for me to see the careers page with lots of cute stock photos of people. I need to see that in action. And if you're not able to make your decisions actually align with the values that you're marketing, then let's re-examine the way that you're promoting that, right? So let's just try all to stay in alignment with what we're preaching out there. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because right now the world is giving all of us a very specific and particular opportunities to show up to actually align our action with our values. And I can't, stress that enough for leaders who are in positions of power, who have the opportunity to actually put money where their mouth or heart is. To be able to make that difference, actually showing out for the most marginalized people, to be able to do that in a very material way. It's not theories, it's actually just who are you hiring, who are you firing, start there at the most basic levels today in this crisis.
Yes, I think that's super helpful tips, Michelle. I think specifically too, connecting back to, you mentioned criteria, right? What criteria have we been using? Why have we been using this? And who might that be leaving out, right? There's a lot of non-traditional folks with non-traditional backgrounds that, have faced enormous barriers given some of the criteria that we've put in place, whether fully intentionally or somewhat unintentionally, but now's the time to get intentional. And I think what I'm hearing you all say is like, this sort of chaos and this disruption is actually giving an opportunity and inviting everyone to be really honest about how these systems were designed, right? Where are their flaws? Where are we missing key elements? How can we disrupt what we have in place so that it can start serving groups that have been traditionally, historically, and currently underserved, and really think about who those groups are, right? We have a number of them. Some folks are specifically kind of bringing up, immigrant populations, veterans who often have non-traditional kind of work experience or potentially educational experience, folks with disabilities in particular. There's specific kind of communities within the disability community that have really had a hard time entering traditional workforces. But now that our traditional work is looking really different, it allows us to be more open-minded, to really think about how do we leverage this incredible talent. Absolutely. We have just about 15 minutes left, so I want to go to Q&A. There's a few questions just kind of tactically about, is this being recorded? Yes, it is, and we will distribute that out afterward. Are the notes in the chat going to be made available? Yes, we are going to take kind of what you've been submitting in the chat and create a spreadsheet to share with everyone who registered. So appreciate those questions. Now, okay, I'm looking at the Q&A, and let me see what we feel like we haven't gotten to. There's some questions, and this matches some of the ones that came in early. Is what if there's not established D&I at my organization? How do I begin to set a foundation right now, as opposed to maybe shifting some of the things that have been done?
I can dig in. I think one thing is to leverage data, and data don't have to be, you have insights into your HRIS system or whatever spreadsheet it is you keep your employee data on. It can be conversations, it can be qualitative, it can be, feeling out how folks are feeling about your culture. Data, stories, experiences, they're all one and the same. So start with the data and really get clear on like, what problem are you trying to solve, or what opportunity are you trying to seize, right? So if it's really about proactivity, then maybe you want to get in early to this point around, not getting into DIBs or DEI debt, get in early so that you're not baking these inequities into the fabric of how you all operate. If the data suggests, whatever those data are, that you might be having differential outcomes or experiences for people across lines of identity, well, that's very compelling as well. So I think start there, like make the case for change in some way that is compelling and convincing. And then I firmly believe, to this point around solidarity that Helen raised, that there is always a coalition of the willing, and there's always a vanguard of folks who are probably thinking some of the same things you are. And I think, if it's a safe environment, hopefully you can extend a more public invitation for others to join with you. Form a committee, start picking apart what your priorities might be. If you're in an unsafe environment, one, I'm really sorry about that. That's unfortunate, but I think you can still, create some whisper networks, find folks who are like-minded, and start doing some individual work. If you see certain problems, we heard this before, you can be the change that you want to see. And something we know, it's true today, and it's also sort of an allegory, emotions are contagious. And so if you all kind of figure out how more human do you want to make your culture, or what processes might be broken, get involved in those processes, be an interviewer if you can of candidates, give peer feedback, find those little inflection points. I think is like the kind of most grassroots way to start. Michelle?
Yeah, I would say that one thing that I always want to be mindful of is folks whose full-time job is not DEI, often shouldering the burden as marginalized people themselves. So I just want to give people who are the onlys, who are the tokens, who are the most marginalized in the workplace, to give yourself the permission to not take on that job, right? And for you to ask for someone else to actually do that work for you, if that is what it requires of you to be able to show up to work and do your best work at the workplace. Right? So leverage your manager, right? Leverage your manager and say, hey, this is really bothering me that this is the way that we are handling whatever process. I just wanted to let you know and let them handle it. If they don't handle it, that's information for you to understand in terms of how they are willing to show up for you and for the company. I just want to really make sure that, this work is not trivial, right? Like, this is emotionally taxing work. That's the reason why Awaken exists, so that we can actually come in as third parties to say the things that you all may not be able to say, and push the envelope a little bit and be able to take on that burden off of the marginalized people's shoulders. So I think if you have the energy and the wherewithal to do it, then yes, go for it, but solicit help from other people, get the support of people who are, well-intentioned allies, and coach them through how they can support you and show up for you, rather than taking all of that burden and risk, frankly, of showing up in that way as a marginalized person in the workplace on your own. So be strategic about how you care for yourself, because that's first and foremost so important for marginalized people in the workplace, and give yourself permission to ask for help and support, and to not do anything beyond surviving, because that in and of itself is activism, in my opinion.
Oh, that's so good. I'm glad you on that. Thank you for checking me on that, because that is definitely my privilege in these conversations, is like, I was going to be doing this no matter what. So I forged a career out of it, and I'm making money, and I'm happy, happy, happy. This was like always me. but that doesn't have to be you. So that if is a huge if, and thank you, Michelle. Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Relatedly, there's been a lot of questions around kind of specifically how more ideas around how to support the most marginalized. Some examples like even essential workers and the communities that may not be directly in our workplaces, but are tremendously essential, to use that word, in us being able to even operate and show up and eat and exist right now. But also folks, there's been a few other communities kind of called out and asked about ageism. So folks who are older in the workplace kind of facing some bias around this using technology. There was some questions around, service workers. So thoughts on and specifically around allyship too. So how do we support the most marginalized, and as allies, how do we continue to cross sort of these perceived lines in order to get to solidarity?
I think solidarity requires, and there are a lot of questions there, so I'm just going to peel off one. But I interestingly this week, NYU's Global Inclusion Office had their Solidarity Week. And so they had a number of featured speakers and programming, also released some resources. And it used to be named, so Solidarity Week used to be named Allyship Week. And I found, that shift in language really interesting, because allyship often is something that is performative, that people are looking to do something visible, to recognize and to get that check, yep, look at me, I got my ally badge, I got my ally shirt. And that's not how this works. That is not how any of this works, right? We're looking for people who are willing to do, and people need to be doing the hard work. That's what solidarity looks like. It looks like using your power, your privilege, to what Michelle was saying, going to leadership, and then that leadership saying, hey, this is a problem, we need to fix it. And also centering those communities, those marginalized and impacted communities in what you do. Michelle also has a great post on allyship, what that looks like. But I think we need to shift from that, mindset of allyship and this performative into solidarity and the underlying action that girds solidarity. Solidarity is moving in step for people.
Yeah, I think allyship is a complex topic that has been diluted and that has lost its integrity. So because I think allyship still has some cultural capital for us to be able to continue using, but if we can actually bring the essence back into allyship, which is rooted in solidarity, which is rooted in centering the needs of the margin, I think we will all benefit from that conversation, because I know that we've gotten an influx of requests of doing allyship workshops. And I know that there is a demand for having those conversations and people wanting to show up as allies. So let's actually take a moment to unpack what that even means. What is allyship? What is not allyship? Let's not just treat allyship as a performative act or even like a savory thing, because I think that's also something that people always crave, is like, just tell me how I can intervene when there's harm. I think actually allyship has a lot to do with inward work, how we view ourselves and how we show up in this world, and also what is needed by the communities that we're looking to be in solidarity with. And there are very specific ways that we should be using that word and showing up in that way. And I know words like accomplice is also something that is showing up, which has roots in the Indigenous community. And I just feel there needs to be some real criticality to us using these words with nuance. Again, I'm a fan of nuance and context. So I would implore everybody to actually sit with that, the approach of allyship, and really examining what that is, because a big part of that is actually not about intervening. Yes, there's intervention work, absolutely, and putting yourself at risk to be able to do that, I think, is huge. But there's also accountability part, where a lot of people don't talk enough about taking accountability for our own actions and our own harm. And I would love for us to be able to continue talking about that. And I'm so glad that topics around white fragility is also something that's surfacing these days, because all of these things are related and linked.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That connects to some questions and comments that have come in too from folks saying, how do I be a resource, or how do I engage right now if I'm unemployed, if I'm not currently in an organization? And I think, to your point, that suggestion that you just gave, and that we talked about earlier, is doing your own work, right? There's work for all of us to do right now, and thinking about, who am I connected to? Who am I having conversations with during this time of physical distancing? What are the comments that those friends and family even are making, and how can I start to ask questions to help raise their awareness, to push back, to share information, resources? A lot of what you mentioned, Helen, how do I dig into the history that might not have been super present in how I was taught it, that this, combating this erasure of certain groups. So there's a lot that can be done on an individual level right now, depending on our locus of control. We are approaching time, so I'm gonna wrap us up here in just a moment, but I wanted to give just an opportunity to folks in the chat. One, to share if you have any suggestions. Some folks have been sharing thoughts and suggestions, but while we all are in this work, so are many of you. And so if you have any ideas around how to really center the most marginalized right now and always moving forward, as well as any remaining needs you have or questions, I ask that because we have an intention to send this information out to everyone who registered, so that you all can continue in community if that's something that you would like, that you can start resource sharing, knowledge sharing, potentially doing some of this work together. Because this is such an incredible community of people that came together today in the hundreds. At one point, I think we had close to 500 folks on the line. So, oh, I see Helen. Okay, so sorry, Helen.
No, it's okay. I know we're winding down, and I just wanted to say a couple things. One is, I think it was Katrina who said, if we had a magic wand, and what would we like to see? I just want to say that one thing that this virus is not changing is the demographics of this country and where we are headed. DEI exists partly because the strategic planners, 20 years ago, realized where the employee base and the customer base was heading in this country. And if today we took all the people of color, people of conscience, and women, and put us all together, we would be in the vast majority of this country. And what we've been talking about is how people have been divided deliberately to keep people apart. Well, the trend is more that within the next 10 years, 15 years, there's not going to be any majority race in this whole country. And so what are we going to be looking at of the workforces and the workplaces in the future, our own communities? And there is something we can each do, short of intervening and fearing that we might put ourselves at risk or accelerate a situation. And that is to what you just said about learning and doing our own work, but acknowledging, people who experience hate or racism or being vulnerable, the one thing that they feel most is being invisible, that something happens and nobody even says, oh, I heard the boss say something to you about that. I'm not with that. What can we do about it? And that's what we can all do. So, there's a lot to be done, but this is your future, everybody's future here. And we can change this. This is a moment where we can really do something.
Thank you so much, Helen. That's a perfect way to wrap up, I think. That inspiration, but also that's actionable, right? What can we do? Hey, that's not okay with me. I saw what just happened. I heard what happened. How are you? Checking in with folks and then saying, what can we do? I'm committed to change. I'm committed to solidarity. And I'm committed to the future that we want to see. I want to thank all the panelists again. Oh my gosh, what an incredible conversation. Michelle, Helen, Katrina, Erin, it's been an honor to be part of this. And thank you to all the participants, hundreds and hundreds of you. You elevated this conversation. You really helped make this as rich as it was. So we will be sending out a follow-up email with information, contact information for us. You can follow us and connect with us, as well as the chat and your questions and some of those things. We encourage you to answer each other's questions, to make connections, to continue this work together.
Megan, thank you for being an amazing moderator, for everything, for being an amazing leader.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe,
Thank
stay
you.
connected.
Stay safe, be well.
Bye.
Yes.
Thank you.